Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for I believe this is the third in our Earth Month series. Quick disclaimer here, we have some legal stuff that we need to do whenever we do our live events. WasteWater Education is a public outreach and consulting organization, and we are dedicated to the advocacy for the protection of water as a vital human and ecological asset. We do this through the implementation and the management of affordable, appropriate wastewater systems. We are a national and an international education service provider and host facilitator. We're independent and impartial, and we assist individuals and communities to discover the financial and the environmental advantage of implementing sustainable integrated water infrastructures. Because quite simply, water is water, not waste. The disclaimer, the presentations that we host and make publicly available should not be construed as an endorsement or a paid advertising. We do accept and encourage sponsorships and underwriting, and that enables these education events to be provided at no charge. Please visit our website to learn about our current and our upcoming events. You can sign up there, obviously, for our newsletter. And here's a link to our most recent annual report, and I will put that in the chat window. We are committed to making these education events available to those with hearing, sight, or other disabilities, and those for whom English is not their primary language. So once the event has been published to our YouTube channel, you'll be able to access closed captioning and also enable translation services. The video credit for the short video we're going to show now to set the scene is from a companion 501c3 nonprofit, Science Friday. And if you've never gone to Science Friday, again, let me put that link into the chat window here. And because this is Earth Month, we thought this would be a very appropriate video to start with. So bear with us. And sometimes your buffering might cause some issues with this, but let's keep our fingers crossed.
Last week, scientists at NASA released this. The shot is compiled from data from NASA's VIRS instrument, which orbits the Earth about every 100 minutes, taking measurements of light coming off the planet. That can be translated into ribbons of imagery like this, and then into one of these. And this is just the latest in NASA's Earth from Space album, which may be one of the most mind-expanding collections of images in human history, in my opinion. It began with a shot taken by the Apollo 8 crew in 1968. And NASA scientist Gene Feldman says it made a big impression on him.
I think it's called Earthrise. And I remember seeing that and the stark contrast between this gray, lifeless rock that we had spent all this time and effort getting to. And here was this beautiful little shining blue and white marble that held everything that we as humans know about history, art, culture, love. Everything was contained on this one little tiny dot in space. I was just so fascinated by the beauty of it and trying to understand, how did this happen? How does it work? Has kind of led me to do what I've done.
And for the last several decades, Feldman has done remote sensing.
Yeah, there's an old expression about sometimes you can't see the forest for the trees.
That is not a problem for a remote sensing scientist. Feldman studies the Earth from space. He says it's like taking vital signs of the planet, which means working with
scientific images that maybe show ocean color or sea surface temperature or land vegetation, or those are why we do what we do, to tell us about the planet from a clinical perspective. But the other images, the beautiful ones, they resonate with people because it's our home.
In 1972, we saw our home in a new way. Apollo 17 astronauts snapped this picture. Actually, they snapped a lot of pictures.
It crystallized so much about the environmental movement at the time. It gave people the first look at their home planet as a single entity.
In 1990, Carl Sagan made this Voyager image famous, his pale blue dot. Here he is on Science Friday talking about it.
I thought, that's us, a mote of dust in a sunbeam. And it spoke to me about the need for us to care for one another and also to preserve the pale blue dot, which is the only home we've ever known. And it underscored the tininess, the comparative insignificance of our world and ourselves.
Then in 2002, Blue Marble 2.0, NASA's Rob Simon made this. And it had wide appeal too. For example, it ended up as the default background on the iPhone.
I didn't even know until I bought an iPhone and turned it on and kind of did a little happy dance.
Simon's job is...
It's primarily taking data and making pictures out of it.
That's what this is, a composite of data sets from several different instruments translated into a picture.
To us, the really cool thing was the data set. Up until that point, there was no realistic color map of the globe anywhere.
So the land layer here comes from
the Moderate Resolution Imaging Spectroradiometer aboard Terra.
And the tricky part here was the weather.
So we actually had to take clouds out.
They stashed the clouds for later, went onto the ocean. That came from an instrument that measures phytoplankton in the sea.
Where it was low, I colored it dark blue because they're low mostly in mid-oceans. And then where it was a little bit higher, it was like a little bit brighter green.
Then add the clouds back in.
There's a small problem with it because there's a very slight gap in between each orbit.
So some of those are painted on.
It is photoshopped, but it's has to be.
Then
there was another layer to sort of simulate the atmosphere.
And then there's this little bright spot.
It's called the specular highlight. So it's the reflection of sunlight off of water.
Those are the pieces, but you can't just slap them all together.
It just didn't look realistic. It looks kind of flat, or the clouds are sort of too see-through. So I just hit Command-Z a lot.
There's artistry to creating the world.
What I imagine it to be. Unfortunately, I'm not an astronaut. I've never been to space. But I've looked at these images over and over again, trying to sort of get the essence of it.
With satellite data, like this map of chlorophyll and land vegetation over time, accuracy is key, obviously. But it's also most easily deciphered as imagery, Feldman says.
Because the data volumes that we get from space now are astronomical, the only way that we can really handle this anymore is to visualize it. And no matter what computers we may build, the human mind and the human eye, in my mind, is still the most powerful integrator of information.
The objective here is to create models that accurately reflect the past so that we can predict how the planet will change in the future, Feldman says.
Or if some of those changes might be negative to the way we want our Earth to be, what can we do about it?
Simon wants to make the world better too, starting with the atmosphere.
And I'm getting results that I like, but I think it's a little bit exaggerated. So I'm working on some techniques to try to tone it down a little bit.
To make it a little more homey. For Science Friday, I'm Flora Lichtman.
I do encourage you to go to the Science Friday website and look at some of the stunning imagery that they've pulled together into these short little education segments. But looking at the imagery we just did see brings to mind how the events of last year unfolded and how we watched in a sort of fascinated horror the stream of storms coming off the coast of Africa and realizing that they were all lined up one after the other and making a beeline right across the Caribbean and Puerto Rico and the Leeward Islands and the Antilles and the Virgin Islands. And I cannot imagine what it would have been like to have been on that island and to realize there was nowhere else to go and that you just had to wait it out. And as we've seen from news reports, some of these people are still waiting it out. And so at this point, I would like to introduce, and let me switch over here, my good friend Luis Huertas, who I've known for several years now. And when I discovered that he actually has family that were directly impacted by this, I was thinking, now there's somebody who we would like to have do a presentation during Earth Month. And at this point, Luis, I'm just going to hand this right over to you and mute my phone line.
All right, thank you, Dendra, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to everybody about this issue and just give a quick update of my perspective and how I see things happening, and just give a quick overview of what's going on the island. I'm going to make this a little bigger so you can see a little bit better the slides. On that image you see there at the top, it's not really the two storms. You see Harvey at the left, Irma is in the middle, and then George, which never touched land. And then Maria came after that. So that's an interesting, it's the first time in the history that they keep track of that 3 storms are in the water at the same time. So first of all, what happened? Most of the effects actually happened on the east end of the Caribbean. It did impact other islands, but the major brunt of the disasters were on the east end of the Caribbean, and that's kind of where I'm more aware of, so I'm going to be focusing on that area. The 2 storms actually happened 5 days apart. So you see the path of Irma and then Maria. When Irma went by, there was a big devastation on the British Virgin Islands and the northern islands on the chain. And things were starting already to get prepared on the southern islands, like St. Croix was going to be the base for the support systems and helping the recovery for the northern islands on the U.S. Virgin Islands and the British Virgin Islands. And then everybody had to stop what they were doing because Maria was coming. And then Maria ripped through St. Croix and the southern islands, and that's when everything kind of fell apart because everything was being staged already because of Irma when Maria happened. So all the support that was going to be there kind of got caught in the storm, in the second storm. So that's something that I think in the future they're going to be better prepared to handle. Just some images of what happened. San Martin got really hit hard. Barbuda was literally wiped out. 100% of the buildings in that island actually suffered damage or were destroyed. And by Maria, by Irma, and then when Maria came, they had to evacuate the entire island. So this is the first time since pre-Columbian times that Barbuda didn't have human habitats in it. So you can see some of the damages in Barbuda and San Martin. San Martin also is an island that is split. Half is French, half is Dutch. But 95% of the structures on the French side got destroyed or damaged, and 90% of the structures in the Dutch side got destroyed. So it's a lot of devastation. Here in St. Thomas, the slide that I'm showing here, there were people inside of this public housing project when the storm happened. So walls blew up and people were inside of those spaces when in the middle of the storm. The storms were so strong because they're low pressure systems. The stronger they are, the slower they move. So at one point they were moving at 5 miles per hour, and it took about 12 hours for each one of the storms to go by within the hurricane wind strength area. So it's a big zone that people have to endure quite a bit because it started in the afternoon. Both storms started in the afternoon, so they had to ride the entire night, and then mid-morning the next day is when the wind was calm enough to go outside again. So yeah, this building now has been condemned and is getting demolished. In San Martin, this is the landing strip. Probably people have seen the picture that tourists are standing at the beach and there's this gigantic KLM plane, 747, landing almost on top of their head. Well, that used to happen right there where the ocean is hitting that road. That used to be the beach that happened. So the beach is gone. There is a lot of beach erosion because of the storm, the sea impacting the edges, and also the storm runoff from inside the islands running up to the beach and eroding the edges. So a lot of coastal areas got impacted, and they're probably going to have to be new maps drawn because of this. A lot of devastation. One of the issues that actually got exposed when the storms went by is all the illegal construction that was happening without permits or not following building codes. So a lot of that got damaged, ripped apart. If it was not well built, masonry and concrete was no match for this storm. There are some videos on YouTube that entire concrete slabs just fly up because they're not tied correctly to the walls and columns. So this is the kind of context that people were working in. Another thing that happens inside a hurricane is that there's these microbursts, small tornadoes inside the storm. So sometimes you see damage like this, that there's one or two houses that are completely obliterated, and then the house next door barely has anything. And that's what it causes that. So there's a lot of those little lines all over the place. And it's not exclusive to one island. All the islands were like that. And the entire grid, power, communications, roads, sewer systems, water systems, everything got shut down, destroyed, or damaged. So, this is a classical picture from a road in Puerto Rico that after the flooding receded, this is what the road looked like. There were some reservoirs in Puerto Rico that got overflown, and there's gigantic flooding on the north coast of the island. And it took like 2.5 weeks, 3 weeks for the flooding to recede enough for people to actually come across it, and services to start supporting some of those areas. So that was part of the logistical problem also, that the storm goes by and it stops raining for a little bit and then it continues to rain. The storm dumped between 22 and 38 inches of rain in 12 hours, depending on where you were. But then after that, there were another 60 inches of rain that happened within the next 2 weeks. So it's not like it's dry and everything is drying up, but it's a constant rain that happens afterwards. So anything that gets covered or salvaged, then it gets wet again. And a lot of the things that can be salvaged gets wet, mold grows on them, and then they're just destroyed. Also, because there's so much water running around, there was a lot of landslides up in the mountains in Puerto Rico and all the other islands. And those landslides wiped out basically the road networks. So all of a sudden, there were places that were totally inaccessible by road or trail, and the only way to get to them was through helicopter, or having to walk all the way around the island to get around another point. With the storm surge and also with the runoff, all the debris that was ripped through the storm started running downhill and started collecting in major urban areas. So this is in Dominica. The road looks dry now, but that turned into a big river of water, and all this debris is running in it. So if you got caught on that, they were done, and they were damaging all kinds of buildings and infrastructure. Another issue that happened also is that all that debris clogged up the storm sewer system where there were storm sewers available. So this is part of the public housing development in Puerto Rico and San Juan. So all of a sudden, all this water has no place to go, and it's just sitting there. And it's mixed with sewer, with sewage, so it's not the healthiest. and there were issues with this. The pumping that was in place also, because there is no power, didn't work. And then when the emergency services got to the place and they connected generators to run the systems, they were clogged up with all kinds of stuff, so the systems never actually worked properly. After a while, it took a few weeks to get that clear up. So some examples are Bart. This is a smaller island that is a French territory. So not too much in the news, but the biggest impact in St. Bart after the flooding was more ecological than structures. Again, boating is a big part of the community, part of the lifestyle of being in the Caribbean and connecting all the islands. Not only leisure, but businesses. So a lot of these usually gets protected inside mangroves. People move their boats to mangroves, so the opposite ends of the islands, where the mountains in the islands protect from the wind. But in this occasion, it was so strong and it came from all directions that nothing, if your boat was not put away correctly, it ended up in a pile like this. There were some crossings in St. Croix in the Virgin Islands that it took almost a month to clear some of the channels to get into St. Croix. And also there is also big push for renewable energy. A lot of those projects actually got damaged. Not all of them. This is going to be another issue that the discussion is going to happen on the specifications. You can tell the difference on who knew how to specify correctly on how to tie things down versus this. A lot of this is not really tying down, it's debris flying around and tearing into other stuff. St. Thomas, everything kind of got destroyed. So. And the other aspect is also ecological. This is El Yunque. This is the only national rainforest in the National Park Service. And it looked like that right after the storm. There was not a leaf to be found. All kinds of endemic and native trees got destroyed and ripped off from the roots. There are some endangered species also that were compromised. There is a parrot, a Puerto Rican parrot, that there's only like 80 of them left, and there's a big program trying to bring them back from the brink of extinction. And about 12 of the 30 that were flown free, that they were already out back in the wild, died in the storm that they were able to track down. The forest, as a forest, always regenerates and is in the process of regenerating, but it was a big, big blow. And the same happened in St. Thomas and St. John. St. John is a big natural preserve. So there's a lot of vegetation debris, not only building debris, that had to be contend with. Just in the big picture of things, this came out not too long ago about the estimate on the cost of the hurricanes. This is in billions of dollars. So you see that 3 out of the 5 storms happened this year. And they're just going to get worse as time goes on. There are other estimates that are specific to the islands, and they're not any prettier. For example, in Dominica, the estimate is that it's 216% of the gross domestic product of the island. So it's about $1.31 billion just to the damage that it caused on the island. So we're expecting to invest in some of the restoration of these systems. So the resiliency is becoming a big subject. The subject that, of course, is in everybody's mind because it's present on the news all the time now is the power. A lot of the systems are dependent on power. This is a picture of pre- and post-storm. Just a little note that now Puerto Rico is in the longest blackout of the U.S. history and the second in the history of the world. There's a couple of ways that people are measuring that. One is just the actual generation of the power. But then the distribution of the power is another story. So right now, yesterday, I believe it was, there was another blackout, and there was one last week because a tree fell on a main distribution line. Yesterday was somebody on a backhoe kind of broke a cable somewhere. So they're having all kinds of issues of the weak infrastructure that was there before the storm that now, because of the storm, gets exposed. The lack of maintenance, the continuity of monitoring and operations is coming to the forefront. Not all the islands are the same. So you have those issues in Puerto Rico, but in the Virgin Islands, they had agreements with other power companies put in place before the storm. This is a lesson learned from Hurricane Hugo in 1989. So once the storm hit, there were crews coming down already aligned to come and fix the grid again. So the grid that Maria took and Irma took was put in place when Hugo came by and did basically the same thing in 1989. So yeah, another issue is the erosion that I mentioned before. This is just a sample of the level of erosion that happened in Puerto Rico. As you can see those numbers, you have 40, 71. Those are meters of coastline that get lost because of the erosion. Some of it is because just the storm erosion from just the churning of the ocean, and other places is because that's where the main exits of major rivers are at. So the flush out of the storm water from the rivers actually bled and kind of cut through. And all this sediment and soil is actually landing on coral reefs. So coral reefs are taking a pounding as well, and it's a big issue because they sustain all the ecology around the islands as well. So what happens with the initial response? In all the places and all the islands, the first thing you need to clear are airports and ship ports, just so you can get access to the services and support that you need. So there was a big push to open the airport in all the islands to get access, because you can't even help people until all the roads are clear and all the airports are open and all the ship docks are open, just to get people in and out, and equipment and resources and food and water. So airports were the first thing that got open, and then ports, ship ports were open again, docks. And then after that, they started working on actual roads. Since everything was down on the ground, people had to be very careful in terms of live wires and things like that in some places. People started using generators, and the generators were backfeeding into the grid that was on the ground. So there were a couple of times that there were issues with that, people getting shocked from that. But the National Guard was in place, all the first responders were in place. The good thing about a hurricane in terms of preparedness is that you see it coming for a few days before, so you can plan ahead some of those issues. It's not like an earthquake or a tornado that all of a sudden happens. So there were people already in place. The National Guard was activated, all the first responders in terms of police, fire, medical services were ready to go once the storm passed. So you get some of the National Guard from other states actually came down, and this is where it's different for all the islands, because each island group has a different relationship with a bigger country. Like the colonial ties are still there, like Dominica, Antigua, and Barbuda have and the British Virgin Islands have the connection to Britain, and then St. Martin has the connection with the Dutch and the French, and then St. Bart's is French, and Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands is U.S. So you have all those military countries coming in from different places with different resources at different levels. So not all the islands got the same level of support that you would expect. So when the military came in, the first thing that they did is actually bring water, potable water. Everything was bottled water, and food. Those two are the critical components for any survival, so those were the first things that they came in with. And it was a constant flow once they started going for about 4.5 months, 5 months. Water was coming in bottles, and food was military rations, basically. So you got, and then after all the airports were set up and started to flow, the flow of equipment and material, then they allowed the NGOs to come down and support them as well and expand the services, so they got more support. You see, bottled water was everywhere, still is, even though like in the Virgin Islands, power and water are back up already, 6 months into it, unlike in many places in Puerto Rico, up in the mountains is not available. So get some more samples of that. So all the islands, there were points of distribution, and the logistics of just having enough people in enough places was a big task, even with the planning. And of course, in the U.S. territories, FEMA took over the control of the logistics. So they had FEMA, the Corps of Engineers, the National Guard, and then the government of the Virgin Islands, with the governor being the head leader. This is Martin. And then the people themselves, people didn't just sit around and waited. They just jumped in and started doing what they needed to do. I know some farmers in St. Croix on the west end where the rainforest is, and they lived. It took the National Guard 10 days to get to them, just because of the amount of debris and all the trees and everything that was in the way, really, to get in there. So the National Guard and the support services were working their way from east-west, trying to get to them, and they were working their way out from the houses west-east until they connected. And it took them 10 days. And this is people with chainsaws, machetes, everybody, all hands on deck. So even little kids were moving stuff around to get out. Then from the islands that did not get affected, so islands further south like Trinidad, Barbados, Aruba, Curacao, Bonaire, some of the Central American countries, individuals on their boats actually got together and started doing missions, rescue missions, bringing in water and food on their own. And once they got with the first shipment to the islands, they connected with an NGO, and then they started the logistical structure. So it extended very quickly with private. First, Irma went by, and Irma did not hit Puerto Rico. It hit the British Virgin Islands and then the northern islands of St. Croix, and then further east to Antigua, Barbuda, and Kitts. And Puerto Ricans did the same thing to those islands, and then Maria came by and ripped through the middle of the island, so they had to stop. But they were doing that already for other people. So it's a big community that, even though they don't connect politically in many ways or physically, it's still a big community that support each other. Lines were ubiquitous, so there were shelters and then distribution points, and the distribution points became long lines every day or every other day. They were pacing the rations for everything, so you will get rations for 3-4 days, and then you have to come back and get more. That way they were managing how much people got. So you got like 4 weeks of food there, or your family of 5 or 6 at a time. So you get different food. The other issue that happened is that the distribution of fuel. Of course, there's no electricity, so there's no way of pumping the fuel that is available. In several of the islands, like in St. Croix, there is big refineries. So they actually refine and produce their own fuel locally. They don't bring it from outside. But like in Puerto Rico, for example, there were lines, and everybody you see there with a container is actually fuel for their generators. This is not for their cars. So everybody was chasing fuel for the generators, diesel or gasoline. So a lot of the power well, all the power really, right after the storm, and in some places up to today is being run by generators. This includes people with support systems and life support systems, medical support, everything is being run with generators. Then in the center of Puerto Rico, you still have the issue of not having potable water off your faucet. So people are going back to the springs, the natural springs. They're piping it up and then using the water, boiling it, and then using it for all their services. It was funny that there is a picture, I couldn't find it, but there's a picture of somebody actually have a clothes washer machine next to one of these springs and a generator. So they were washing clothes right next to the spring because that's where the water was for that, instead of having buckets of water and washing by hand. So I find it very funny. The other big issue with the islands, the smaller islands, not so much Puerto Rico, but the lesser islands, is there's no place to stay. So people from FEMA and the National Guard and support services and the lineman that came down to install the power grid again had no place to stay. So the cruise ships actually donated the cruise ships as a hotel. So they were floating hotels. In this picture, you see two in St. Croix. One of them is actually for FEMA and all the government officials and agents and employees. And the other one was a Mercy ship. Right after everything kind of got in order, they offer for people to leave the island via ship or plane. So American Airlines and Continental and Delta had Mercy flights once a day for a week and a half or so. And then Royal Caribbean and I can't remember the other cruise line, they actually had 4 cruise ships that they would take people out of the island and take them to Miami. And then you're on your own after that, but you didn't have to pay for that. And they treated everybody as if it was a regular cruise ship. So, and a lot of the people that left were either people that needed medical assistance that couldn't get it at the island, or there were kids that were about to finish high school or graduating and going to college that because of the schools being destroyed couldn't finish. So they were sent to Florida to finish school. And this is for all the islands, not just St. Croix, but the U.S. Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, Dominica, the British Virgin Islands, Antigua and Barbuda. So everybody got the same treatment by the cruise ship lines because they port in a lot of the islands. So that's kind of one of their main pieces. And it was a very nice gesture from them. So you see there the cruise ship and then the Mercy flights as well. I couldn't get my parents to get on one of those planes. They're just too stubborn. That's the quality that the islanders have is they're very resilient people. So these people that are leaving are real need. A lot of the people also that left have not returned. So like if, for example, in the U.S. Virgin Islands, about 10% of the population left and they haven't returned. Same thing happened when Hurricane Hugo happened. About 10% of the population left and never returned. So yeah, so you get those stories, and there's reasons for that. So the current situation, so the big challenge now is to clean up everything that is there. So there's a lot of waste that needs to be handled. So they have allocated a few of the agricultural areas that are big parcels of land in every island to kind of do this. So they're separating vegetated, recyclables, and then waste. But how to handle that after that has been a big point of contention, especially in the Virgin Islands. That was a big point of contention. In St. John in particular, FEMA wanted to just burn the material that was vegetated instead of creating compost out of it and give it to the farmers. And they got taken to court and prohibited to do that. So So now they're doing that. In that pile of wood, there's a lot of mahogany trees and white oaks and incredible tropical trees that were 200, 300 years old, incredible thickness that you can, old growth forest type of wood that actually got ripped off the ground and they were not salvageable. So there's now a movement to capture all that wood and give it to our local artists to do some artwork with it. And then the rest is going to get done into composting. The rest of the waste is going to be taken out by FEMA off island. There is so much of it, but it has to be taken out of the island to process it. The same with Puerto Rico and the British Virgin Islands. There's other issues that came to light because of this, is that landfills are full. So there have been issues of what to do with the trash. And that whole conversation has come back to the forefront and how to handle that. There's no resolution yet, but for now, that's what's going to happen. There's a big concern in the near future. There's so much debris to process and ship out that they're afraid that by the start of this season, they're not going to be done, and there might be a lot of loose stuff that if another storm hits, it can cause some damage. So that's a big concern they have. There's slowly people building up, cleaning up, all hands on deck. So you're starting to see now all the streets are open again and things are coming back in place, and slowly they're restoring what was there. There is a big divide in terms of resources. A lot of people that had insurance, in the Virgin Islands in particular, the mortgages had a mortgage insurance, and they discovered when they went to put the claims that none of those policies cover hurricane damage. So there's a big class action lawsuit because of that. So I'm sure there's going to be a settlement for that. But yeah, slowly but surely, people are rebuilding their lives and rebuilding the buildings. There's bigger issues up in the mountains and inaccessible areas and poorer areas, just because they don't have the same level of resources as other people. So there is an army of nonprofits and NGOs that are going in with all kinds of things. For example, this here is a homemade kit for filtering water because they don't have potable water yet up in the mountains in Puerto Rico. So there's a big movement to do this, and there's another crew of NGOs that is trying to reforest the islands. Also, there is another crew that is trying to bring organic farming. One of the big issues in the food side is that before the storm, 85% of the food was imported into the islands. After the storm, that went up to 95%. And because the storm took everything else, now local farming was obliterated. And it's just now starting to come back into life. So there's all these crews around trying to share seeds and share know-how and bring volunteers to help to bring back the farms back up and running as the volunteer services. And there's also military help just to clean up, so waste management and all that. So you see a quick example of how that is helping coordinating things. The money that is coming in now is being funneled through these NGOs and then distributed to local nonprofits that are doing the actual groundwork. So, for example, when I was down in St. Croix, there was a church group that was going around helping senior citizens cleaning their debris from their houses, house by house for free, and organizing all the debris, making sure that they didn't get hurt doing that. There's all kinds of glass flying around and metal edges that were sharp, dangling, and wood and debris. It's just a mess. With the restoration, there are the linemen. These are the most popular people in the islands right now. Just to give you a perspective, to install the grid, at one point in the Virgin Islands, there were about 780 linemen working between the three islands. On average, all three islands have, as a regular crew, 80 people. So that's the kind of increase of manpower that it took. And the U.S. Virgin Islands right now is all back up and running in terms of the grid, and anybody that can get connected to the grid is connected, and the generation is happening normal again. The same with water and wastewater services. The blue tarp roofs, this is a program that the Corps of Engineers has. Unlike in the United States, there is a limitation of space, right? So in the United States, something happens in Florida, then you can move people to Georgia or Texas or, Wisconsin, but not in the islands. So what they do is that they assess the facilities, and then if you can live in your house, even though it might be damaged, they'll put a blue tarp on it, and you can get back into your house. This is in addition to relocating, like in the U.S., the U.S. territories, in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, they did relocate a lot of people. From Puerto Rico, there is people living in 49 out of the 50 states that were relocated after the storm because their house blew away and they didn't have anything and they needed a place to stay. So the government actually sent them off to different states. So the only state that doesn't have anybody from Puerto Rico under that program is in Hawaii. But those programs are not everlasting, and they're getting to the end of the funding for that. And so new issues are coming up about, now I'm stuck in the States, how do I get back, or how do I move on from here? But the Blue Tarp program is something that keeps everybody in their place, in your property. You don't have to live in a shelter because the shelters are schools and other facilities that are needed for logistical reasons and to keep moving. You want to send your kids back to school, or so you can have a bunch of people at the school living while the kids are at school. So this is a good way for them to stay in place. The other movement of help that is coming in is private companies, and this is probably the most famous, best publicized effort, really. This is the Children's Hospital in San Juan. Tesla actually sent the entire system to get the hospital off the grid. So the hospital is running off the grid like before. So they're doing surgeries and everything that needs to happen, and it's a donation from Tesla. And they're going around the island, several islands actually, doing the same thing with critical components of the infrastructure. So hospitals, fire stations, police stations. And it's not just Tesla. There's an army, I'll say about, at least I know of about 4 or 5 that are doing this full-time with energy. There's other people that are focusing on water, but on energy, and the intent is that to create some more microgrids instead of depending on the whole grid of the island. The difference between the United States versus the islands is that the grid in the U.S. goes from coast to coast. In the islands, each island is its own grid. So the economy of scale and the efficiencies are not there. And because they got different government regulations, they're not all the same government. So they got different levels of quality and quantity and environmental controls. And even though they all use the same power system in terms of voltage, they're not connected. There might be a few islands that are connected. For example, from St. Thomas to St. John and Tortola, they're connected. And there is a plan to connect all the islands from Trinidad all the way to Cuba. But the missing piece is that piece between San Martin and the Virgin Islands. There is a big, deep hole there that there is no cable. Between St. Croix and St. Thomas, there is a big depth in there that there is no power cable rated for that depth, so they couldn't connect the islands together. But the generation is there, so it's just a matter of time when that happens. So also what is happening now is that a lot of charity organizations are coming down and helping the poor people to rebuild. So you see all these crews going around from churches and volunteer works, and they're basically going around and rebuilding house by house, one structure at a time. It's going to take a long time to do this, but it's happening. It's not that it's not happening. The other big ecological restoration project that is happening is that the restoration of mangroves. Mangroves protect the coast from storm surge and from the loss of the coast, the erosion. So now there is a big push to start growing more mangroves around the islands to protect them from the storm surge that are coming. This in combination to reforestation and also upgrading building codes and land use. You will notice that when you go to the Caribbean, there is a lot of people, everybody wants to be at the coast, right? Everybody wants to be at their beach house right on top of the water. So there's discussions now on what's the best way to go in about that or not, and just interesting ways of approaching land use and restoration. In other pieces of the islands, some are more tropical than others. So the more tropical you are, the more effort in reforestation with native planting is happening. So you get the two ends and trying to control the in-between. So that's just a quick sample of all the effort that FEMA has been doing after Maria. This is covering Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands as of March. You'll see, how much water, meals, generators, debris. Something else that is in this list is things like public assistance, because the hurricane blew businesses away, basically, literally. So now people don't have a place to work, and all of a sudden people get displaced for housing and work. So FEMA is helping, supporting small businesses and all businesses really, to carry over employees, and they're hiring them to do the restoration, so they're trying to keep them in the island as much as they can. And they're still hiring, so there is not enough people in the island to do everything, so they're still hiring experts, people that know how to do stormwater or make assessments, or there's some positions for historic restoration, etc. Here you can see the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the blue roof installs. Those are the roofs that we were talking about before. So there's quite a few of them. So what's next? One of the effects that this is having in the island that started before the storms but got accelerated, particularly in Puerto Rico because of the financial crisis, is the big exodus of people. Right now, the tally is over 360,000 people have left Puerto Rico, and the population is 4 million. So it's a considerable chunk of the population is leaving, which is eroding the tax base, which brings the resources to rebuild, so that's becoming a challenge. So in the other side, people are sending money, and there is some entrepreneurs that are coming back to the island to kind of rebuild. So it's a big trade-off of people coming in and out, but right now there is a net loss, really, not the kind of exodus you want to see. So this is getting compared now to when the Industrial Revolution happened, and there was a big exodus from the island in the 1940s to New York City and Chicago of Puerto Ricans. So it's similar. It's actually bigger now than what happened in the 1940s. But other islands, people are staying put. The smaller the island, the more resilient. Some people might call them stubborn, but not really. They are really resilient. That's their home, and they're going to stay put, and they're going to make every effort to make it work and be home. So planning long term. A lot of the governments are actually having these discussions in terms of resiliency and how to go about restoring. Some of the challenges they're having right now in terms of getting this government support, like for example FEMA and federal government, is that the law says that we're going to repair what was there up to how it was, right? So you cannot ask for, oh, there's a better way of doing this, why don't we rebuild doing that? They will tell you, no, we'll build it the way it was, and then if you want, you can spend money some other way to make it what you want afterwards. We just want to keep you up and running the way you were, bring you back to where you were. So there's some discussions happening about how to change that and make the funding available to improve the condition rather than just back to where you were. And every island is different, every government protocol is different, and there's some discussions, for example, in the British Virgin Islands on how to go about that. There have been some committees in all the major jurisdictions discussing this, on what's the next step, what are the appropriate approaches, and what's right for the particular island. So there's no one solution fits all, although some of the general principles are probably going to be the same. But there might be some openness to other ideas that were not practical or political palpable before. One interesting note in Barbuda is that the land rights in Barbuda are unique, I think, in the world, because they were part of a reparation package after slavery was abolished, and people have been inheriting the land. So nobody has a land title to their land in Barbuda. It's all by inheritance. And there was some suggestion after the storm that people should just get titles for $1, and the Prime Minister almost got run out of office because saying that. So that's an interesting dynamic there. The other issue that they were having, especially in the British Islands, is that there were so many of them that they would have exceeded some European Union regulation if they helped everybody. So they had to decide who to help. And Dominica did not get any help in terms of funding to rebuild. So that was a big, unpleasant notice. But there are other organizations that are putting together money and kind of distributing it just in different channels. So the World Bank is involved, the United Nations is involved, the Small Island Development States. This is a committee inside the UN that is specific for technical assistance of small islands around the globe, not just the Caribbean. But the majority of them are there or in the Pacific Islands. And then the Organization of American States is giving a lot of support as well. And CARICOM is the Caribbean region political structure where all the small islands are coming together as one for regional purposes. And they are handling a lot of the distribution of the other more international donations. For example, through CARICOM, the Netherlands is donating like $702 million, and the European Union is donating $352 million, and the World Bank is $140 million. Canada is giving $78 million, China is giving $30 million. So they're all going to CARICOM, and then CARICOM distributes to the individual countries and NGOs. There's also other NGOs like the Clinton Foundation or the Virgin United. Richard Branson, as you know, is a resident of the British Virgin Islands, and he rode the storm on his own private key. That is a resort as well. So he put together a foundation using Virgin United to help rebuild throughout the island. But yeah, there is a lot of effort happening, and people are beginning to get edgy again because this year's storm season begins in July 1st. So it's around the corner in a couple of months, and they're not ready. They're not ready right now. They're trying to move to be ready. It's just they're not there yet. There's just too much work to be done from the other storms to catch up to that. But they're moving. They're moving. They're not being shy about it. And this symbol, this image that I have here is, I think, the most catching of the idea of the resiliency of the people in the islands. It's like this mango tree that took down by the storm, so it got trimmed out, and it started growing again, stronger, more beautiful, and it's already producing fruit for the next generation. So I think that that's a good emblem, and I think I'll stop there and take any questions if there are any.
Oh, thank you so much, Luis. That's quite a striking image, I think. If anyone has questions, they can put them in the chat window, or if you have a microphone, you have a USB headset, and you would like to ask your question in person, do go ahead and do that. While we're waiting for that, I'm going to switch over to the closing screen here. And as Luis said, if you would like to run through your list of entities that are helping, still continuing to help.
Yeah, the list of links that is listed in there shows the different jurisdictions and what the main organizers of the funding. So if you want to donate to the recovery effort in a particular place, those are the best sources and reliable sources. They're not, every time something like this happens, you know how there are scams all over the place, but these are verified and actually government-run and government-managed sites, so you can trust them, and they are controlling the flow of the resources to where the best places go. So for example, Tim Duncan in the Virgin Islands, he jumped into action right after the storm, and the government set up this with the Community Foundation to manage that funding, and the British Virgin Islands is the same, and St. Bart's actually has a government site certifying what the nonprofits that are legitimate to donate to. So you can donate directly to the foundation in St. Bart's or to the government. So those are the most reliable right now. I'm sure there are more, but these are the better known that I can share.
Okay, and you'll see there at the bottom of that screen is Luis's contact information. If you would like to touch base with him about other ongoing projects within the islands, I'm sure you'd be quite happy to talk to anyone about this. Also, there is a file share pod, and let me just move this so you see where this is. And that is a PDF low-resolution copy of Luis's presentation today. To download it, just highlight it and hit the download button. This, of course, will only work if you're watching the original recording in our Adobe format. We will be posting a link for that. If you are watching this as a YouTube version of this, we'll make sure that there is an access link for you to be able to go get that after finishing watching your recording. At this point, I'm not seeing any more questions. There is one thing that we do have to do, and that is to thank our underwriters, because without the generosity of these folks, we would not be able to provide these at no charge. And so just want to say thank you to Parson Environmental and to Concrete Sealants. And And at this point, Luis, if you have any closing comments, do you?
Well, just like to thank you for the opportunity to comment and keep people aware of what's happening, because this is an ongoing issue that needs attention and cannot be ignored anymore. So thank you for the opportunity, and I'll be happy to answer any questions or give contact, and I'll try to connect people with the right person in the island.
Yeah, I think it was a sobering thought that, we're so used to seeing our garbage carted off and it goes somewhere, but when you are on an island in the middle of the ocean, where does it go? And if it's still laying around, and as you said, July the 1st starts the new storm season, that just becomes fodder for more damage. So kind of a sobering thought there. But thank you so much, Luis. I really appreciate you coming into the Earth Month series and presenting on this. And so at this point, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to close the recording. And thank you, and we do encourage you, of course, to make a contribution and to assist this ongoing and for a very long time ongoing situation. So thank you and good